The Wrong Door. A story of mistakes, kindness, and finding home. Malcolm Carter never believed in accidents. Every step of his life had been carefully measured work, his daughter, survival. But one rushed moment inside a quiet hospital changed everything. He opened the wrong door, stepped into the wrong room, and left flowers beside a woman who was supposed to die alone. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He only knew the room felt unbearably empty. That small mistake, walking into the wrong hospital room, pulled him into a life he never planned. A dying woman, a grieving, single father, and a love that arrived when neither of them was ready. But both desperately needed it. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor of St. Mary's Regional Hospital, and Malcolm stepped out into the quiet corridor. He checked his phone. Room 418. His friend Devon had been admitted 2 days ago with pneumonia, and Malcolm had promised to visit before his shift at the warehouse. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and something else Malcolm couldn't name, something that reminded him of 3 years ago, when he'd walked these same halls every day for 6 months, watching his wife slip away. He didn't like hospitals. He didn't like the fluorescent lights or the beeping machines or the way people spoke in hushed voices, as if death could hear them. He carried a small bouquet of sunflowers, Devon's favorite. Malcolm wasn't good at this visiting sick friends, knowing what to say. But Devon had been there when Malcolm's wife died, had helped him figure out how to be a single father to an 8-year-old girl who suddenly had questions he couldn't answer. His hands tightened around the cellophane wrapping of the flowers. The plastic crinkled softly in the silence. He could hear a television playing somewhere down the hall, canned laughter from some sitcom. It seemed wrong, that artificial cheerfulness in a place where people came to fight for their lives. Malcolm turned left at the nurse's station, counting doors. He stopped at what he thought was 418, but the number on the door was partially obscured by a maintenance cart. He hesitated for only a second before pushing the door open. The room was dim. The blinds were drawn. A single lamp cast weak light across the bed where a woman lay, her body so thin the blanket barely rose over her frame. Her eyes were closed. An IV drip hung beside her, the clear tube running into her arm. The monitors beeped softly, rhythmically. Malcolm froze in the doorway. This wasn't Devon's room. But what struck him harder than his mistake was the emptiness. No flowers, no cards, no sign that anyone had been here at all. Just the woman and the machines keeping her alive. He should have left. He should have backed out quietly and found the correct room. Instead, almost without thinking, Malcolm walked to the small table beside the bed and set the sunflowers down. The plastic vase made a soft sound against the wood. The woman didn't stir. Malcolm stood there for a moment, looking at her face. She was maybe in her 40s, with dark skin and gray threading through her hair. Her cheekbones were sharp, her breathing shallow. There was a peaceful quality to her stillness that made Malcolm's chest tighten. He recognized that look. He'd seen it on Rachel's face near the end. He turned and left, pulling the door closed behind him. Room 418 was 2 doors down. Devon was sitting up in bed, laughing at something on his phone. Malcolm stayed for 20 minutes, made small talk, promised to bring his daughter Ava by on the weekend. But the whole time, his mind kept drifting back to the woman in the other room. That night, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table long after Ava had gone to bed. He'd made her favorite dinner spaghetti with garlic bread and listened to her talk about school, about her friend Jasmine's birthday party, about the book she was reading. She was good at filling the quiet spaces. Malcolm wondered sometimes if she did it on purpose, if she sensed how much he needed the noise. He washed the dishes, wiped down the counters, folded the laundry, all the small rituals that kept the house running, that kept him from thinking too much. But tonight, his mind wouldn't settle. He kept seeing that empty room. The woman, the sunflowers he'd left behind. Malcolm had learned to avoid hospitals after his wife died. Rachel had fought lymphoma for 18 months, and near the end, he'd practically lived in that hospital room. He'd slept in a chair beside her bed, held her hand through the nights when the pain medication made her confused, read to her when she was too weak to hold a book herself. When she finally passed, Malcolm had walked out of that hospital and sworn he'd never go back unless he absolutely had to. The building itself felt like a graveyard to him, full of ghosts and memories he couldn't face. But now, sitting alone in his kitchen, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman with no visitors. He wondered if she had family. He wondered if she was awake right now, staring at those sunflowers and wondering where they'd come from. He went to bed, but didn't sleep well. In his dreams, he kept walking into that room again and again, each time finding it a little emptier, a little colder. 3 days later, Malcolm found himself back at St. Mary's. He told himself he was just checking on Devon, who was being discharged that afternoon. But when he reached the 4th floor, his feet carried him to room 414 first. The door was slightly ajar. Malcolm pushed it open. The sunflowers were still there, wilted now, their petals browning at the edges. The woman lay in the same position, though her eyes were open this time, staring at the ceiling. She didn't seem to notice him in the doorway. Malcolm backed away quietly and walked to the nurse's station. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" she asked. "The woman in 414, Malcolm said. "What's her name?" The nurse, whose badge read Helen, studied him for a moment. "Are you family?" "No." Malcolm paused. "I left her some flowers by mistake a few days ago. I wanted to know if she was okay." Helen's expression softened. "Her name is Elena Brooks. She has stage 4 lymphoma. She's been here about 2 weeks. Does she have family?" Malcolm asked. Helen shook her head slowly. "No one's come to visit. As far as we know, she doesn't have anyone." The words hit Malcolm harder than he expected. He nodded, thanked the nurse, and walked down the hall to see Devon. But all through their conversation, all through the ride home, all through dinner with Ava, he kept thinking about Elena Brooks, dying alone in that hospital room. That night, he made a decision he couldn't quite explain, even to himself. Over the next 2 weeks, Malcolm became a regular visitor to St. Mary's 4th floor. But he never knocked on Elena's door, never introduced himself. Instead, he left small gifts outside her room, things he thought might make her days a little less empty. First, he brought fresh flowers. Not sunflowers this time, but lilies and roses. Then, a small potted plant that wouldn't wilt. A blanket, soft and warm, in deep blue. A book he thought she might like, a collection of short stories. Blank greeting cards. A small music player with headphones, already loaded with jazz and classical music. He never stayed. He'd set the items on the chair outside her door, then leave before anyone could see him. He didn't want gratitude. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted her to know that someone cared, even if she didn't know who. Nurse Helen noticed, of course. One afternoon, she caught him leaving a bag of fresh fruit outside Elena's room. "You're the one," she said softly. Malcolm turned, caught. He didn't say anything. "She asked about you," Helen continued. "She wants to know who's been leaving all these things." "I'd rather stay anonymous," Malcolm said. Helen studied him with those kind eyes. "Why?" Malcolm looked down at the fruit in his hands. "Because she shouldn't have to feel grateful. She shouldn't have to thank anyone for not being alone." Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She sits up now, reads those stories you brought. I think knowing someone cares is helping too." Malcolm nodded and turned to leave. But Helen called after him. "She deserves to know your name. Maybe you should tell her yourself." Malcolm walked away without answering, but the words stayed with him all the way home. Elena was sitting up when Malcolm finally knocked on her door. It had been 3 weeks since he'd first walked into her room by mistake. 3 weeks of leaving gifts, of walking away, of telling himself it was enough. But Nurse Helen had been persistent. She asked again today. Helen had said that morning, "She wants to meet you. She deserves that much." So Malcolm stood outside room 414, his hand raised to knock, his heart beating harder than it should. He'd faced difficult things before. He'd held his wife's hand as she died. He'd learned to braid his daughter's hair and pack her school lunches and answer her questions about why Mommy wasn't coming home. But this felt different, harder, somehow. He knocked. A soft voice called out, "Come in." Elena was propped up against pillows, the blue blanket he'd brought draped over her lap. The potted plant sat on the windowsill, catching afternoon light. The book of short stories rested on her bedside table. She looked at him with dark, intelligent eyes. "You're him," she said. Not a question. Malcolm stood awkwardly in the doorway. "I am. What's your name?" "Malcolm Carter." She gestured to the chair beside her bed. "Sit down, Malcolm Carter. Tell me why you've been leaving gifts for a stranger." Malcolm sat. The chair was familiar now, he'd left so many things on it. "I walked into the wrong room," he said simply. "You were alone. It didn't seem right." Elena studied his face for a long moment. "That's a terrible reason to spend your time and money on someone you don't know." "Maybe," Malcolm said. "But it was the only reason I had. And somehow, it felt like the most important thing I could do." Something in her expression softened. "Thank you. For the flowers, the books, everything." Malcolm shook his head. "You don't need to thank me." "I do," Elena said firmly. "Because no one else is going to." The honesty in her words hung between them. Malcolm didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They sat in silence for a while, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just quiet. Finally, Elena asked, "Why do you hate hospitals?" Malcolm looked at her in surprise. "How did you look like you want to run every time you walk through that door," Elena said. "Like being here hurts you." Malcolm swallowed. "My wife died in a hospital 3 years ago. Lymphoma." Elena's eyes widened slightly. "And you've been visiting someone with the same disease?" "Yes." "Why?" Malcolm looked at his hands. "Because I walked into the wrong room, and you were alone." Malcolm started visiting Elena 3 times a week. Not with gifts anymore, just himself. They talked about small things at first. The weather, the food in the hospital, the nurses. But gradually, over cups of terrible hospital coffee, they began to share the harder parts of their stories. Elena had grown up in foster care, moving from home to home until she aged out of the system at 18. She'd never been adopted, never had a family to call her own. She'd worked as a librarian for 20 years, lived alone in a small apartment, built a quiet life that suited her. "I always told myself I liked being alone," she said one afternoon. The sunlight through the window caught the gray in her hair. "I convinced myself it was a choice, not a circumstance." "And now?" Malcolm asked. She smiled, but it was sad. "Now I know the difference." Malcolm leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The hospital chair creaked beneath him. He'd spent so many hours in these chairs over the years. First with Rachel, now with Elena. But this felt different somehow. With Rachel, he'd been fighting to hold on to what he was losing. With Elena, he was discovering something he hadn't known he needed. "Tell me about the homes," he said gently. "If you want to." Elena's fingers traced the edge of her blanket. There were 7 of them. Some were okay, some weren't. "I learned early not to unpack completely, not to get too comfortable. Things always changed just when you started to settle in." "That must have been hard." "It was survival," Elena said. "You adapt. You learn to be self-sufficient. You learn that the only person you can really count on is yourself." She paused. "Or, at least, that's what I thought I learned." Malcolm told her about Rachel. How they'd met in college, married young, planned a life together. How cancer had stolen that future piece by piece. How he'd become both mother and father to Ava overnight. learning to cook her favorite meals and help with homework and braid her hair for school. I thought I'd never stop missing her, Malcolm said. And I haven't. But the missing has changed. It used to be this sharp pain every moment of every day. Now it's more like an ache I carry with me. Still there, but I can breathe around it. Elena reached out and touched his hand. Just briefly. You're a good father. I try to be, Malcolm said. Some days I'm not sure I know what I'm doing. That's how you know you're doing it right, Elena said. They didn't talk about her prognosis. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic the treatment was working. The tumors were shrinking, but they both knew lymphoma was unpredictable. They both knew better than to count on anything. Instead, they talked about books and music and the small moments that made life worth living. Malcolm told her about the time Ava had tried to make breakfast in bed for him and nearly burned down the kitchen. They laughed together, and Malcolm realized he hadn't laughed like that freely, without guilt, since Rachel died. You should bring her, Elena said one day. Malcolm hesitated. He'd kept this part of his life separate from Ava, not because he was ashamed, but because he wasn't sure how to explain it. How do you tell an 8-year-old that you're visiting a dying woman in a hospital? That you're spending time with someone who might not be here in a few months? But Elena was looking at him with such open hope that he found himself nodding. Okay, he said. I'll bring her next week. Ava had questions, of course. She had questions about everything. Why are we visiting someone you don't really know? She asked as they rode the elevator up to the 4th floor. Because she doesn't have anyone else, Malcolm said. And I think she could use a friend. Is she sick like Mom was? Malcolm looked down at his daughter. Ava had Rachel's eyes, dark and thoughtful. Yes, he said honestly. She is. Ava was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Is she going to die too? I don't know, Malcolm said. I hope not, but I don't know. Ava reached for his hand as they walked down the hallway. It's okay, Dad. We can be her friends anyway. Malcolm knocked on Elena's door, and she called them in. She'd asked the nurses to help her sit up in a chair by the window, wanted to look less like a patient and more like a person. Ava walked in, holding a drawing she'd made flowers and sunshine and a small figure with a big smile. Hi, Ava said, suddenly shy. I'm Ava. Elena's face lit up in a way Malcolm had never seen before. Hello, Ava. I'm Elena. Is that for me? Ava nodded and handed over the drawing. Elena studied it carefully, running her fingers over the crayon marks. It's beautiful, she said softly. Thank you. What happened next surprised Malcolm. Ava, who was usually quiet around new people, pulled a chair close to Elena's and started talking. About school, about her friends, about the book she was reading. Elena listened with complete attention, asking questions, laughing at Ava's stories. Malcolm sat back and watched them together. Ava's energy seemed to fill the room, pushing back the hospital smell, the beeping monitors, the weight of illness. For an hour, the room didn't feel like a place where someone was fighting to stay alive. It felt like a place where people were simply living. When it was time to leave, Ava hugged Elena carefully. Can we come back? She asked. I would love that, Elena said, and Malcolm could hear the emotion in her voice. In the elevator, Ava said. Me too, Malcolm said. She was lonely before you found her, wasn't she? Yes. Ava squeezed his hand. I'm glad we're not letting her be lonely anymore. That night, after Ava was asleep, Malcolm sat in the dark living room and let himself think about what was happening. He was getting attached to Elena, to these visits, to the way she made him feel less alone too. And attachment meant risk. It meant the possibility of loss. He'd lost Rachel, and it had nearly destroyed him. Could he survive losing someone else? Should he even be opening himself up to that possibility? But then he thought about Elena sitting alone in that hospital room, about Ava's joy at making a new friend, about the way he'd started to feel like himself again. Maybe the risk was worth it. Maybe connection was always worth the risk. Elena was discharged from the hospital on a Tuesday morning in late spring. The doctors were pleased with her progress. The treatment had worked better than expected. She'd need to come back for regular checkups and continue medication, but for now, she could go home. Malcolm helped her pack her things, the blue blanket, the books, the potted plant that had somehow survived weeks in a hospital room. Ava had come along and chattered excitedly about Elena coming over for dinner once she was settled. "I'll make spaghetti," Ava promised. "It's Dad's specialty." Elena smiled. "I'll look forward to it." Malcolm drove Elena back to her apartment, a modest, one-bedroom on the south side. He helped carry her things upstairs, made sure her refrigerator was stocked, checked that everything was in order. Elena watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You don't have to take care of me," she said finally. Malcolm turned from the refrigerator. "I know. Then why are you?" He thought about it for a moment. "Because I want to." They looked at each other across the small kitchen, and something passed between them. Something that had been building for weeks but neither had named yet. Malcolm cleared his throat. "Elena, I need to tell you something." She waited, her eyes steady on his. "When Rachel was sick, I promised myself I would never let anyone in again. The pain of losing her was." He stopped, searching for words. "It was like losing a part of myself. I didn't think I could survive that twice." "I understand," Elena said softly. "But then, I walked into your room by mistake," Malcolm continued. "And over these past months, you've become." He paused again. "You matter to me. More than I expected. More than I thought was possible." Elena's hand went to her chest. "Malcolm, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know. Whatever happens next, with your health or anything else, I want you to know that you matter." Elena stood up slowly, crossed the small kitchen, and took his hands in hers. Her fingers were warm, stronger than they'd been weeks ago in the hospital. "You matter to me too," she whispered. "More than I know how to say." 3 weeks later, Elena got a call from her oncologist. She needed to come in for additional tests. Some of her latest blood work showed concerning markers. They wanted to run more scans, just to be safe. Malcolm drove her to the appointment. They sat in the waiting room, not talking, both lost in their own thoughts. Elena's hands were folded in her lap, perfectly still, but Malcolm could see the tension in her shoulders. The tests took hours, more blood drawn, a PET scan, consultations with specialists. When it was over, the doctor told Elena they needed to admit her for observation. The markers were elevated enough to be concerning. Back in a hospital room, a different one this time, on the 3rd floor, Elena sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Malcolm. "You should go," she said quietly. "I'll stay until we know more," Malcolm said. "No." Her voice was firmer now. "You should go. Go home to Ava. Go back to your life." Malcolm stayed where he was. "Elena, you've done enough," she said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "More than enough. You walked into the wrong room and you were kind to a stranger, and I'm grateful, but you don't owe me anything. You don't have to watch me die." Malcolm felt something crack open in his chest. He understood what she was doing. She was trying to protect him, trying to spare him the pain of loss. But she was wrong. He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "I'm not staying because I feel obligated," he said. "I'm not staying because I walked into the wrong room 3 months ago." "Then why?" Elena asked, her voice breaking. "Because I choose you," Malcolm said. "Not the situation, not the circumstances. You. I choose to be here. I choose to stay." The test results came back 2 days later. The elevated markers were from old scar tissue, remnants of the cancer that had already been treated. There was no new growth, no relapse, just shadows of what had been. Elena cried when the doctor gave her the news. Malcolm held her, and she cried into his shoulder while he stroked her hair and told her it was okay. Everything was okay. Later, when she'd calmed down, she said, "You meant it, didn't you? What you said before, every word," Malcolm said. Elena looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I'm afraid of needing you. I'm afraid of what happens if I let myself love you, and then I know," Malcolm said. "I'm afraid too. I lost Rachel, and for 3 years I've been terrified of losing anyone else. I kept everyone at arm's length because it felt safer." "What changed?" Elena asked. Malcolm smiled. "I walked into the wrong room." She laughed, and it was the best sound he'd heard in days. "We can't promise each other forever," Malcolm said. "None of us get that promise. But we can promise each other right now. We can choose to be here, together, for whatever time we have." Elena reached for his hand. "Then I choose that too." They didn't kiss. Not then. That would come later. Instead, they sat together in that hospital room, holding hands, choosing each other despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, despite everything that could go wrong. Because that's what love is, Malcolm realized. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to stay anyway. 6 months later, Elena moved into a new apartment closer to Malcolm and Ava. Not with them, that was a step they'd both agreed to take slowly, but close enough that Ava could walk over after school, that Malcolm could bring dinner when Elena was too tired to cook. Elena's health continued to improve. The cancer remained in remission. She went back to work part-time at the library, and she lit up when she talked about getting to be around books again, around people who loved reading as much as she did. Ava had taken to calling Elena, "my friend Elena," though Malcolm could see it becoming something more. He watched his daughter teach Elena how to braid hair, watched them laugh together over cooking disasters, watched Elena read to Ava at bedtime when she stayed over. He wasn't trying to replace Rachel. That wasn't possible, and Elena knew it, accepted it. But there was room in his heart, he discovered, for both the memory of his first love and the reality of this new one. One evening in autumn, Malcolm and Elena sat on her small balcony watching the sunset. Ava was inside, doing homework at the kitchen table. The air was cool, comfortable. Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Elena looked at it, then at him. "Malcolm, I'm not asking for promises we can't keep," he said. "I'm not pretending we know what tomorrow will bring. But I'd like to face whatever comes next as your husband, if you'll have me." She opened the box. The ring was simple, a single stone, nothing flashy. "Then we'll face it together," Malcolm said, "just like we face everything else." Elena smiled, and there were tears on her cheeks. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Inside, they heard Ava cheer. She'd been watching through the glass door, apparently. They both laughed as she burst onto the balcony and threw her arms around both of them. They married 2 months later in the backyard of Malcolm's house. It was a small ceremony, just a few close friends. Nurse Helen from the hospital, Devon and his family. Ava stood beside Elena as junior bridesmaid, beaming with pride. Elena carried a bouquet of sunflowers. Malcolm had insisted. For the beginning, he'd said when he gave them to her that morning. Elena had kissed him and said, "For the beginning." That night, after everyone had gone home and Ava was asleep upstairs, Malcolm and Elena sat together on the back porch. The yard was littered with the remnants of celebration folded chairs, string lights still glowing, a few forgotten champagne glasses. "Do you ever think about that day?" Elena asked, "when you walked into my room by mistake?" "All the time," Malcolm said. "What do you think about?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I think about how I almost didn't go to the hospital that day. I almost called Devon and made an excuse. I think about how if I'd turned one door earlier or one door later, I might never have found you." Elena leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think about how I was ready to die alone, how I'd made peace with it, or thought I had, and then you walked through that door. Malcolm wrapped his arm around her. Sometimes the wrong door leads you to the right life. Elena smiled. Sometimes it does. They sat together in the quiet, surrounded by the evidence of a life they'd built from a mistake, from kindness, from the choice to stay. The future was uncertain, it always had been, always would be. But they had this moment, this night, this love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning. Above them, the stars were coming out. Malcolm could hear crickets in the grass, the distant sound of traffic on the main road. Elena's hand was warm in his, her breathing steady and calm. She was here. She was alive. They were together. He thought about the moment in the hospital when he'd told her, "I choose you." It had felt like the most important thing he'd ever said, more important than his wedding vows to Rachel, because it had come from a place of such absolute clarity. He hadn't chosen Elena because it was easy or safe or logical. He'd chosen her because his heart had recognized something in her that his mind couldn't explain. "What are you thinking?" Elena asked softly. "I'm thinking about choices," Malcolm said. "How we make hundreds of them every day without thinking. Which door to open, whether to turn left or right, whether to walk away or stay, whether to let fear win or love." He squeezed her hand. "Most of them don't matter, but sometimes one choice changes everything." Elena tilted her head back, looking at the stars. "I used to think I didn't," Malcolm said. "I thought everything was random chance. But now—" He paused. "Now I think maybe fate is just what we call it when the right choice leads us where we needed to be all along." She smiled. "That's pretty philosophical for a warehouse supervisor." He laughed. "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain as the strong, silent type." And that, Malcolm thought, was more than enough. That was everything.